Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me, as always, is Angelo Giuliano. But also joining me is, as you can see, Gonzalo Lira and Alex from Reportify Media. And all three have a background in either finance, banking, investment, or a little bit of everything. And so we're going to be talking about what is going on with all of these banks, what is going on with de-dollarization, and how this is all connected to, I think, not just the ongoing proxy war with Russia and Ukraine, but also this buildup by the U.S. against China. And so, without further ado, how about we just, I'm going to go clockwise, go to Gonzalo, just lay things out as you see it right now, and then Angelo, and then Alex. You guys can build on top of what the other says, or add whatever you think is relevant. Let's just get an introduction going. Gonzalo.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you so much, Brian, for having me on. And Angelo and Alex. Angelo, it's great to see you again. Alex, I don't think that you and I have interacted before. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Great to see you.
Thank you. So what we have is we are seeing what looks like a bank run of some sort, because we've had two banks that have folded, that have declared bankruptcy in the United States over the last week. Also, last week, the Federal Reserve magicked $300 billion worth of available cash to buttress any American bank that might be in trouble. In Europe, we have Credit Suisse that has been, sort of like teetering for a couple of years now. All of a sudden, its stock price has tanked, which usually signals in a financial institution that the people in it and around it and their counterparties kind of know that the jig is up insofar as Credit Suisse is concerned. And so the Swiss Central Bank has propped it up to the tune of, I think it was 54 billion Swiss francs, which is roughly 50. I mean, it's almost exactly, there's almost parity between the franc and the dollar, or last I checked at any rate. And so, it looks like this weird little crisis. A lot of people are saying that this is the Lehman moment, because the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers back in 2008 set off the global financial crisis of 2008. I'm not so sure. I tend to think that this is more like the Bear Stearns moment, because prior to Lehman, Bear Stearns, another investment bank, it went tits up. I actually can't recall if it was in March, April of 2008 or 2007, because it bleeds into my memory. But anyway, the point is, see, nobody's quite sure if this is the canary in the coal mine or this is the start of the big one. And so it's all very fluid at this moment. My thinking personally, because I personally am not invested in the financial sector in the West at all, I'm just watching this as a spectator, okay? Because back in 2016, I retired. And as I started seeing that the Western financial system was grossly over leveraged and that things were eventually going to tank, I figured, my sleep is more precious than being up at night worrying about how the markets are doing or how banks are doing. And so I just pulled out, and I'm in very pedestrian investments that just keep me sleeping soundly at night. But I'm sure that the central banks around the world, none of them are sleeping soundly, because this does seem to be the start of something big. Paradoxically, the Russians are pretty much isolated from this whole kerfuffle, financially speaking, because of the sanctions. Because due to the sanctions and the abrupt financial divorce between the West and Russia, Russia really doesn't have any more exposure to the West, apart really from what was sanctioned back in February, March of 2022. And so they're going to be just watching this and just like shrugging, because to them, it's not going to affect them at all. And on top of that, of course, their financial system is sound. We can see that over the last year. It's perfectly sound. Elena is running the Russian central bank extremely tightly and very, very, very capably. And so nothing is going to happen insofar as the Russians are concerned. Insofar as the West is concerned, that is a different story. Angelo, anything I say is a lie or untrue?
No, absolutely.
Well, just to jump in, Angelo, you made a very interesting tweet today about you have a background in Credit Suisse. Is that correct?
Oh,
yeah. I'm a financial analyst. I used to be to do auditing, controlling as well. So I was in Credit Suisse first Boston, and I have also a background also in the hedge fund industry. So I've been around those banksters. I know the culture, and I think we should go back to, I mean, what did we learn from 2008 and where we are now, and why those bankers are still behaving the same. What is happening right now? We have those bankers that are what we call too big to fail. So in the case of Credit Suisse, we have two big banks in Switzerland. We have UBS and Credit Suisse. They're too big to fail. They have one pressure, is return on investment. On the other side is that what happens is that if they fail, they can take bets. If they fail, the government is there backing them up. So it's a vicious circle. Now you have the Swiss National Bank, which is pouring funds, but they are going to repeat that unless we change the way they operate. You see, the problem is that we have shifted. What was the origin of banks in the old days? It was lending money for people, was also to transfer. Originally the Rothschild was a good way. It was a fantastic way to transfer money from one country to another. Now is only profit driven, and this is what the collective West is suffering. And we are repeating the same mistakes. What is going to happen? You're putting $50 billion, but at the end of the day, you have the same personality, the same type of people that are leading those banks. What they're driven by short-term gains. If you're a CEO of a bank like Credit Suisse, you have bonus which are linked to the performance of your stock, and you have bonus based on that. How how the stock goes up is that you need to have high return on investment, and that's how they do. So you have to minimize the investment. You skin in the game. That's what we call the investment. Skin in the game, and you have the maximum return. But when you have this high leverage, you take extremely very high risk. And who's paying the risk? It's we socialize the profit. This is it's so disgusting. You see, the world we're in right now is that when a company makes profits, it becomes privatized. When it makes losses, it's socialized. And I'm not for nationalizing banks and so on. But here in the case of a bank which is too big to fail, well, I think at this stage, maybe nationalize it or you dismantle it, because the problem is that this what we call in the US glass and steel. You separate commercial bank and investment bank. They should be completely separate, because and you have to compartmentalize those banks.
I have a point to add to what Angelo is saying. You see, in 2008, in the global financial crisis, you see, the problems, the fundamental systemic problems of banks were not solved, especially what he was referring to, which was the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which separated investment banking from commercial banking. That was repealed during the Clinton administration. I do believe the second administration by his Treasury Secretary at the time, Robert Rudin, right? Yeah. Anyway, he repealed it, and Robert Rudin was a banker from Goldman Sachs. And of course, banking became incredibly lucrative starting at that point because of the repeal of this law, because it allowed investment banks to basically play with the money that they had accrued from commercial banking. They were able to play with it in investment. That is, playing the stock market. I mean, I'm simplifying it because there are whole asset classes, but it allowed the merging of the two monies between investment banking and commercial banking. And this has proven to be a disaster. The reason Glass-Steagall was implemented during the Depression was prior to the Depression. That had been the case with the banks, that they were investing, i.e. betting, with the money of their customers. And so once those customers all of a sudden required liquidity, these banks collapsed because they didn't have the liquidity on hand to service the liabilities. And so to move forward to 2008, what happened was that Glass-Steagall was not re-implemented, but rather it remained out. And the system, rather than let the banks fail and recapitalize them, renew them, and separate them, what the US government basically did is that they threw money at the problem. They created money out of thin air by way of quantitative easing. They threw money at the problem to ameliorate the problems of liquidities of the banks. And they just kept on marching on, and nobody was held responsible. In fact, the same people who are in charge now, people like Jamie Dimon, they were in charge back in 2008. The group of Janet Yellen, Kashkari, all that whole crowd, they're still around. They still have influence. And so they never learned the lesson of 2008. And so we're having a repeat, I think, of 2008, only on a much, much bigger scale. And we have a war, and we have a pandemic, or, whatever. We have too many problems. It's all happening simultaneously.
Yeah, I want to get into all of that. Alex, what is your initial introduction? How do you see all of this?
Well, once again, thank you for having me on the program, Brian. I greatly appreciate it, and what a great panel. I'm blessed to be here. First of all, I'm going to say a little bit of a disclaimer that this is not an endorsement to buy or sell any securities. Just going to put that out there, first of all. I'm a professional derivatives trader, have been for 2 decades. Lived in Monte Carlo for almost 20 years as well. Lived through the financial crisis in 2008 there. And I will tell you, not one single person in the Principality of Monaco, which is filled with a lot of wealth, a lot of yachts, a lot of billionaires, and a lot of millionaires. There was celebration going on in 2008. There wasn't a moment of sadness at that time. What I would like to talk about today, when we go into more depth, is my analogy of this financial market. I'm almost convinced about 70 to 80% of all publicly traded companies on the S&P 500, that's the top 500 companies by market cap in the United States, are worthless. And I'll pass it back over to you, Brian.
Well, okay, so
Alex is right.
Yes, you can add on to that, but what I want to do now is I want to talk about the conflict in Ukraine, this proxy war, the sanctions that the US and the EU together attempted to destroy the Russian economy with, which didn't really work. What impact is that having on is there any connection at all between that?
Totally.
And
totally.
So, okay, so let's explain again. Let's go clockwise, and Gonzalo, you start.
Okay, I by the way, I really want to hear Alex's take on this. I'll give an analysis, and Alex, you tell me if I'm on the mark or not, because this is what happened. The West wanted to sanction Russia because, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so they thought that they would sanction Russia, no different that they had sanctions, piddly-ass economies or relatively trivial economies such as Cuba or Venezuela or Iran, even though Iran is a fairly large country, but still, economically, insofar as the West is concerned, it was not that big of a deal, and it had been sanctioned since the time of the Shah of Iran, so, flew to that. But the thing is, Russia is a determining player in the global commodities markets, whether you like it or not. They are the second, I believe, largest exporter of oil in the world, natural gas, wheat commodities, all kinds of precious metals, and all the rest of it. I mean, insofar as commodities are concerned, they are a huge player. And so to sanction them, to cut them off from the West, would automatically and very predictably drive up the price of commodities that the modern Western economy depends on. Okay, so when they sanctioned Russia and started shutting down the energy resources, natural gas, oil, to the West, this automatically drove up those prices because, of course, the Russians didn't lose a customer in a dollar sense because they just pivoted to India and China, and they started selling their oil to those customers and others as well And what happened was that the same amount of oil was Russian oil started flowing back to Europe, but marked up because it was going through intermediaries and other processes that are more complex but are not interesting for this conversation. You just take my word for it, but everybody agrees. And so this drove up the price of oil, most especially. Now, of course, especially in the United States, everything depends on oil because the United States is such a large country. You have to transport your goods or foodstuffs, everything, TVs, whatever. You have to transport them by truck. And so inevitably, that higher energy prices transferred to those products, irrespective of other problems going on. And so this has led to widespread inflation in the West. In Europe, it's particularly acute. It's comfortably in the double digits across the Eurozone. Insofar as the United States is concerned, the CPI number, I'm very dubious about it. I follow John Williams at shadowstats.com, which is a great site to follow the actual CPI number. That's a different problem. But the thing is, inflation in the United States rose precipitously. It's come down a little bit, but it's still up there. And so what happens with this inflation, the Federal Reserve became extremely nervous for justified reason, because it started looking as if this transitory inflation was just going to accelerate. And so they started hitting the gas insofar as interest rates, because the Federal Reserve, which is the US central bank, determines short-term lending rates by way of its Fed funds rate, which is the money that it lends to banks overnight. And that is the mechanism by which the Fed controls the interest rate across all the different lending products that banks have. And by raising interest rates rather abruptly, coupled to the fact that the Biden administration pumped out so much money at the beginning of its term in order to prop up an economy that was already going up, but they put in even more cash. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. And so all of a sudden, the Federal Reserve, by way of its interest rate policy, decided to try to extinguish that fire a little bit, that inflationary fire. And so this created market distortions and lack of predictability insofar as the bond market, specifically treasury bonds, which all of a sudden have become toxic assets. And so toxic assets in the sense that there are assets you don't want to hold because you're going to wind up losing a great deal of money. And so this is the problem that's going on. Okay, this has been incompetent monetary policy by way of what the Biden administration promised, and also by way of the sanctions imposed on Russia, that has created, I hate the term perfect storm, so I'm not going to use it, but it is the coincidence of several factors that has led to higher inflation, requiring the Fed to hit the brakes on the economy by way of raising interest rates, that caused basically all of a sudden the rug was pulled out from under many banks. SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank, that's the problem that happened to it. It got caught on the wrong side of its treasury bets. And so all of a sudden these banks need a bailout. I mean, you see the problem. The people who created the problem are not now trying to salvage the problem by the same thing that created the problem originally, which was printing money. Now they're going to print some more. And on top of this all was triggered by the fact that the sanctions were imposed on Russia that kickstarted this inflation. You guys, is this analysis more or less on the money?
Yeah, I just want to ask a real quick question, and then you answer it very quickly, and then pass to Angelo. Do you think that the confidence in the U.S. financial system, because a lot to do, especially with the dollar as a reserve currency, it has to do with confidence. When they were seizing Russian assets, the U.S., the EU, Switzerland, I believe, was involved in this, at least to an extent. Doesn't that also play a contributing factor to at least maybe not triggering this, but accelerating it, making this problem even worse?
Absolutely, because what happens is that foreign clients see how Russian assets are seized, and there is no war between the West and Russia. Okay, sequestership, which is the legal name for the term of seizing a foreign country's assets, it's only triggered, it ought to be triggered at least, by way of an actual declaration of war. But there's no war between the West and Russia. This was an arbitrary measure. It was frankly illegal. But because of this, the level of confidence of foreign investors has been deeply shaken. The Chinese over the past year have sold off, I think it's about $100 billion worth of, 100 billion. I might get the number wrong, or it might be a trillion. I forget the number at this point, because the zeros are so many, but they've sold off their treasury bonds. And I know for a fact that Chinese individual assets, individual Chinese investors and so forth, they are pulling money out of the West because they're scared. They're scared that war is declared on China, and just by virtue of being a Chinese citizen, they lose access to their own assets. And so they're pulling out of the West because of this. And they're investing this in, of course, China. And something similar is happening with Russian oligarchs. In fact, Vladimir Putin gave out in his speech a couple of months ago, basically an open-ended invitation to Russian oligarchs to, come back to Mother Russia. All will be forgiven, and you can invest your capital in the West that hates us, but here in Mother Russia, where we love you. And so, this is a pulling out. And when the people that you go to borrow money, the Chinese and the Russians and other countries, when those countries start no longer lending to you, because that's what's basically going on here, the Eurasian continent has been lending money to the West to maintain its lifestyle. When this happens, it's like when you hit the limit on your credit card, the ceiling on your credit card, and you are no longer able to live the life that you had become accustomed to. This is happening.
Angelo.
Alex, do you want to answer to Gonzalo? Because I think the question was addressed to you. I think was related to interest rates. You want to add something?
Yeah, and actually, Alex, I also want to, because you said that there was celebration, and is this just because these people are like a parasite class, and basically the bailout and everything was just the dinner bell, basically, for these parasites to keep feeding?
Well, I mean, capitalism in Monaco is not a dirty word, but you have to understand that the caliber of people that are down there, they are there for mostly tax structuring or the lack of no tax structuring. As you know, that taxes are not on the law of the books in Monaco, so you cannot be charged for tax evasion or tax avoidance because simply the law does not exist in Monaco. So most of these individuals are high net worth or pension funds or mutual funds or even investment banks go there. Credit Suisse is located there. EFG Bank is there. A lot of the really big banks. Now, what I meant by that comment, and I didn't want to, really say that in a way that to refer to some of my friends that are still there as parasites, but I'll tell you that in the banking business, when there is an absolute catastrophe in the markets, on every trade, there's a winner and a loser. And on that trade in 2008, and we saw it again on February 15th, 7 minutes after the U.S. market opened, that was in 2018 on February 5th. Look at what happened to the market that day. That absolutely wiped out many, we'll call it, the best way I can say is a lot of people that were playing the option market. Within about 4 minutes, it wiped out probably, I would say, close to 90% of option traders in the United States with the blink of an eye. Now, jubilation, 2008, yes, there was, because when there's one door to get out on a market and everybody's running for the same door at the same time, there's a bid there, and that bid is going real low. And I'll give you an example. We look at these companies and we look at these banks. I mean, if you're a shareholder in Credit Suisse, once again, this is not a recommendation to buy or sell any securities, but when you're looking at Credit Suisse right now, when you pumped in 54 billion, that company's worthless to the shareholder. Look at SVB, shareholders wiped out. So let's start with the easy part to this market here. Grandma and grandpa that have pension plans or your relatives or whatever. Hello, Mr. Broker. I would like to buy stock ABC. Well, sure. You want to place a bid? Yes, I would. Your offer's been accepted. That's granola. That's kindergarten trading 101. Okay. But behind that whole scene is a derivatives market that is playing against you. They're the house. And you are the little guy that comes in and you put your little chips on the table. Now, if they can wipe banks out in California and they can manage to pump in multi-trillion dollars into these S&P indexes during even the I'll call it pandemic. I won't use the C word, but during the pandemic, and pump that much money in. Well, that quantitative easing now has to be reversed, and it's quantitative tightening now. So all that free money that was lent out at zero made its way into the system, inflated. Can you imagine this? And I'll hand it over to you in a second, Angelo. Stock prices going up in worldwide economies that are shut. Okay. Pretty much every country around the globe was closed and the market is rallying. Okay. That's one thing that you got to put into your books and say, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. It shouldn't, and it didn't. So fast forward is all this money now was in these public companies. Once again, back to 2008 example, jubilation, free money. Let's take it. Let's pump up our balance sheets. And now the money has been spent. It's going out into the system. It flooded the system, inflationary levels. And imagine this quote. This is a quote, everyone. We still think the economy is positive, so we are trying to slow it down. That was said by the chair of the Federal Reserve. What kind of person or country wants to slow its economy down? Now, you might say inflation. I'm sorry, but now we're seeing the results of the collapse of these banks because the quantitative tightening is coming in. This is not a bust. This is a super boom we're about to experience. I'll pass it over to you, Angelo. Thank you.
Yeah, what is the source of the problem? I think we have a huge problem, which is in terms of regulation. And who writes the regulation? The problem is that we take people from those banks, usually Goldman Sachs, like people like Goldman, like Paulson, who was, what was his title? Treasury
Secretary. He was managing partner.
Is an ex-Goldman Sachs. So we are giving to the banksters, we are giving them the right to write the rule of the games to protect ourselves against those same banksters. You see that it reminds me of there are some so-called democracies where we give the rules of the game, which is the constitution that is supposed to protect us against the elites. We give the right to write those constitution to the elites. That's the same with banking, and that's the problem of revolving doors. So they are writing the rule of the games, and again, we should be protected from those guys. And the problem, there's so much money inside this, is that they can buy anyone. They can buy anyone from the SEC. SEC, they take them from the SEC and they go to Goldman Sachs. After some time, they go from Goldman Sachs and they go back to SEC, and that's a problem. I just want to add one thing, that is related to the sanctions. And that is related to the case of Credit Suisse. If we go just back like a week ago, the situation of Credit Suisse in terms of liquidities, the ratios, according to the FINMA, which is the regulatory body in Switzerland, and to the national bank, Swiss National Bank, it was okay. There was not a major problem. Now, SEC comes and says, oh, you know what? We're not happy with that. You need to look at your reporting. So that single thing made the stock drop by 30%. That's one thing. Second thing, we have right after you have the credit notes, the ones that gives the credit, the notes, like Morning Stars, they dropped the rating. I feel there's an attack directly or indirectly from the US when it comes to Swiss banks. Why? It comes back. I'm going back to the Swiss bank being forced to put sanctions on Russia and to freeze assets, Russian assets. So there was $20 billion that were frozen of Russian assets. What happened right after that? You had lots of very wealthy individuals from Asia, from the Middle East, from everywhere, the global south. They saw that and they were like, we are no more safe with Swiss banks. Well, hundreds of billions left Swiss banks. So you have, if you add up all those elements, this is why you have the Credit Suisse, which is actually dropping so much. because the fundamentals of Credit Suisse, it was not dramatic. Now it's the perceptions. What happened is that the stock went down, but that's this perception of the stock by investors. So I think it was just. I think there's a work. I think there's a invisible hand there. Of maybe some manipulation there from the US. I mean, just the SEC. What the SEC did was extremely unfair. When you hear that the company has problems with its reporting from the SEC, you can be sure the next day the stock drops by 30-50%, especially if it's a bank.
Yeah, it's that's very serious when they come out and say something like that. I'm wondering.
I just want to point out something.
Go ahead, Gonzalo. Sure.
Yeah, about Swiss banking. See, the problems with Swiss banking really started in 2012 when the Obama administration basically strong-armed the Wegelin Bank, which is a private bank in Switzerland, strong-armed them into revealing their client list because they wanted to take care of American tax dodgers. And see, that's when the Swiss banking laws were corrupted. They were threatened. Wegelin Bank was threatened with removal from SWIFT. And so they had to. The Obama administration used the international system that was based in the United States to pursue a short-term political agenda, because the SWIFT had never been used as a threat against any bank in order to achieve some politically useful end for the United States government. See, the United States relentlessly pursued American tax dodgers in Switzerland, but they never resorted to this sort of blackmail, which the Obama administration was the first to do in 2012 against Wegelin. And what happened that because of that, Wegelin eventually went broke because of it, and because everybody pulled out their money. And more to the point, the Swiss banking system basically said, we will not take American customers anymore. Okay, that was their response. They acquiesced to the Americans on the one hand by revealing the names of all American citizens that had accounts in Switzerland, but at the same time they removed the problem by basically saying we're not going to take American customers anymore because of this issue. Okay, and so therefore, the American government, what's it going to say to Switzerland? Give me the name of other people on your client list. At that point, the Swiss, rather than start turning decisively away from the Americans, at least, they kind of like continued on as if things were normal. But as Angelo said, that's when Swiss banking started going down the tubes, because other countries started realizing, hey, maybe the Americans will strong-arm them again if I'm Saudi, if I'm Russian, if I'm Chinese, if I'm whomever, of a targeted country or a targeted people. The American administration, the United States created the SWIFT system in the post-war period. It was a very useful system in terms of banking messaging in order to transfer funds quickly. To Alex's point, which was the whole point of, or Angelo's, I forgot, the point of like the Rothschilds transferring money from one country to the other. That was the point of it. It was a bedrock system that undergirded the American system of exporting its debt and bringing in foreign monies so as to live high on the hog by way of credit, which is what the United States and the West generally has been doing for the last 40 years. But see, by weakening SWIFT for short-term political gain, as the Obama administration did in 2012 and subsequently, and especially now with the sanctions, where the Russian central bank's assets were frozen. I mean, this is major, right? And Ursula von der Leyen is saying that they have to figure out a way legalistically to steal those assets and give them to Ukraine, which is, the Zelensky regime are a bunch of corrupt thugs, for crying out loud, right? Well, all of this makes the rest of the world lose confidence in the American system. And this is catastrophic for the Americans and the West in general for two reasons. Number one, the West depends on getting cash from the rest of the world to support its social welfare programs and its defense spending, number one. And number two, the rest of the world's economies are catching up. And in terms of purchasing power parity, the rest of the world is larger than the West. And so, in nominal terms, perhaps not, in purchasing power parity, yes, and by other more sophisticated measurements of an economy, most definitely. And so what you have is that the Americans, by a short-term approach to using the tools at hand, has weakened confidence in the rest of the world in the Western financial system. And so the only way out for the West, for the European Central Bank, the Swiss Central Bank, and most especially of all, the Federal Reserve, they're going to have to just print money. And this money eventually is going to make its way into the real economy. And you're going to have a loss of faith in the dollar. The dollar, in the path that we are going now, it is inevitable that it will hyperinflate and eventually become worthless. It is inevitable, because this process that I've outlined, this is the exact same process that has happened in every country that has hyperinflated. They lose the ability to get credit from overseas for whatever reason. They start printing to make up the difference, and that printing works for a while until all of a sudden people start realizing, hey, this currency I have in my hand, it's really not worth anything. I can clean my butt with it, but little else, because so much of it is floating around and sloshing around to shore up the liabilities that the financial sector has of this particular country. This is going to happen unless radical measures are taken, and there is no political will for those radical measures to be taken. And so we're going to see the crash of the euro and the dollar inevitably.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought up SWIFT, and it's an ecosystem of processes, systems, the dollar, the way that money moves around. This has all been dominated by the West, but more recently it's been weaponized by the West. And everyone is looking at each other and saying, well, they're doing it to Russia. We're pretty sure China's next. China's our biggest trade partner. This is toxic. This is not a system that is worth being a part of. And we saw efforts to create alternatives for years and years now, since this has all been going on. So we're going counterclockwise. I want to throw this to Alex first. Sure. Banking and finance, this is all supposed to serve the economy, but it feels as if people have hijacked it first, almost to create a casino out of it, to create wealth out of doing nothing, but also weaponizing it. And I think either one is bad enough, but they're doing both right now. And it almost seems desperate at this point, especially the weaponization. What do you think about that? And because you're based in China, we were talking about Russia. What impact is this going to have on China, do you think?
Well, that's a two-part question, so I'll answer the first part. First of all, banks don't really care about your deposits. It's very clear. They don't need your deposits as well. Just by the announcement this morning that a lot of these banks are backstopped, basically bail-ins, not really necessary a bailout, but it's a bail-in. So, for example, during the crisis, the banks just say, yep, been a bad boy, in a little bit of trouble, give me some cash. Money flows in there. Depositors, well, you're protected up to X amount of money in each country. Each country has their own kind of protection. The average customer was pretty much, blown out of the banking business many years ago. You're just a person that is there to use their services, which you pay for, whether it's credit cards, 1-3% or whatever. That's all you are to a bank. The good old days when you used to take that jar of pennies and nickels in to get money and put it in your bank account and gain interest, that's long gone. I mean, a great memory, a beautiful thing to have. But how you can win against this is purchasing things like, and I'm going to sound like a gold bug here, but it's starting to make a lot more sense. I've been buying gold now for the last 14 years, as much as I can, when I can, averaging it out. And once again, this is not a solicitation to buy or sell anything, but all I'm going to say is that if you have something that you can hold, that they're not going to lock the door on, somebody's not going to answer the phone if you need to wire out money when banks are collapsing. Can you imagine that? Why did not most of these Silicon Valley companies that had billions in these accounts, Roku's just a general, we'll call it a high-tech company or maybe a streaming service, 26% of their assets are sitting in a bank in cash. I mean, who is working for Roku in the compliance department where they could set some of these assets? And let me give you an idea of what I mean by that. Is if you have cash in the bank, yes, if a bank gets wiped out, it's gone. But if you have securities, stocks, not in the actual bank itself, but if you have securities, let's say in Microsoft or Apple or something like that, that cannot go to a creditor. That is a security which belongs to your name. So if a bank goes bust, if you still have your shares and stocks, those are in your name. That's one way to protect it. So if you're sitting on a lump sum of money, try to find some of these stocks that you will feel are going to be around the next day. But like I said at the start of this show here, is I'm pretty much convinced most companies that took a large amount of money during the we'll call it the pandemic for free, their balance sheets are pretty much worthless. And to answer another comment for Angelo about the Securities and Exchange Commission, it's amazing at how many people don't use that free service, sec.gov. Open up, see what's wrong with the company. I was reading the balance sheet of Credit Suisse 4 days ago when I was getting phone calls from my buddies saying, get ready, write as many short derivatives on this thing as you possibly can. Hammer it into an oblivion. And I can tell you, all these options expired at 12 noon today in Europe. Look at the timing on that, okay? And I'll talk to you guys later about what I do. And, I don't own one single share of any publicly traded company. And I'll get into that later. The second part of your question, you wanted to answer, Brian. Can you just
sure
throw it out to me one more time?
Yeah. We were talking about how this may or may not affect Russia. What about China? How are they going to be impacted by this?
You see, a lot of Chinese buy real estate, and that's where they put a lot of their money into real estate. Sure, you're going to have savings. Banks are going bust right, left, and center. I predict probably maybe 200 to 300 more banks worldwide will shutter their doors here, whether that's either from a takeover or whether it's a bailout or whether it's an outright bankruptcy. That's kind of a number that I've been speaking around in the financial community. But when it comes to China, you got to remember China is really kind of what they're doing to Russia. The United States have basically shut the Americans off from that banking system. Now, it wouldn't surprise me that meeting that is going to be happening with Xi and Putin. I have a feeling, and this is just speculation, everybody, but I have a feeling that there will be a lot of new branches from either the Bank of China or ICBC Bank heading to Russian cities in the near future. That's kind of where I think we're going to see this disconnect from this banking system. And I think there's going to be two systems coming up here, two really different systems, one that may attract people to Southeast Asia and lean towards China and the RMB. And then we'll have the collective West, Five Eyes, go to the American side. And I think we will finally get that disconnect, which I think is great. It's competition, world competition. Back to you.
Thank you. Angelo, do you have anything to add? Because it's the same question. You're also in China. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, Credit Suisse poses a systemic risk. I mean, if Credit Suisse falls where it was to fall, well, this is it's going to would have an impact everywhere. Even though we see the world decoupling, especially Russia, but I think the impact would be worldwide. But again, I doubt that the Swiss National Bank would actually let down Credit Suisse. It's impossible. There would be such a huge impact on the Swiss economy and worldwide. I just want to add, we had this discussion with Alex before on the gold, and it's important to give precisions. If you want to be extra safe, just buy physical gold. At least that's a very good hedge in times of inflation, very high inflation. I think additional to that, I think there's an interesting discussion. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Michael Hudson. He was on the gray zone, and he gives a very good explanation on when it comes to the dollar hegemony and the Ponzi scheme. It's important to understand, for people to understand, that in reality the dollar hegemony is a Ponzi scheme. The system of the US, the way they designed it, can work as long as you have countries or corporation that keeps investing into US debt, because in reality it's like a Ponzi scheme. If people, countries, they stop investing to US debt, then the whole system fall apart. So you see, in reality, I think Russia and China very early on, probably a decade ago, they already started, quote unquote, declaring war on the collective West, not by weapons, not kinetic, but that was actually on the currency. What is happening, the sanctions, what we saw those days with Ukraine, that's something very small compared to what they started earlier on. What happened in Ukraine for Putin, for Russia, was actually an opportunity just to push into using rubles or other currencies to trade Russian commodities, and it was a way to accelerate the de-dollarization. So in reality, when you look at this Ponzi scheme, it's basically the USA, they have a trade deficit. So they sell less than what they buy. And that trade deficit can be only compensated by countries like China buying US debt. But China has stopped. It's been they have a $1 trillion of trade surplus, China. What does China do? They're dumping the US bonds, and they invest into tangible assets. Belt and Road Initiative. Why do you think there's a project of putting trillions of dollars over the next decades into the Belt and Road Initiative? That is the way for China that China found to recycle its US dollar trade surplus. This is why the collective West the US is really mad about this Belt and Road Initiative, because when you have so much trade surplus like China, you have to find a solution with that money. What do you do with $1 trillion that you have of surplus every year? And this is why, the US is at war with China. It comes down always to money at the end of the day. If China was willing to do what Japan did actually in 1985, keep on funding the US trade surplus by buying US bonds, but maybe they would leave alone China. But China is not going against that. Why would you have a lavish lifestyle in the US when just because you hold the global currency, and they stop that. And this is why we are where we are now. It comes down to money.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. The U.S. is so upset with it, they're literally arming and backing terrorists to physically blow up projects and physically kill engineers working on it. Just so people understand how serious the U.S. is about this. Now, going to you, Gonzalo, I want to continue with this theme, the impact on China, Russia, but also we see Saudi Arabia. It's starting to pivot, and this has huge implications because of the petrodollar. Maybe you would like to talk about where that is right now at this time.
Sure. The problem with the United States, you see, when it decoupled from the gold standard in 1971. Because of the problems of the expenditures on the Vietnam War and on the Apollo missions, that created, and the United States no longer had the gold reserves to face up to its obligations insofar as the dollar being backed by gold, because the dollar was previously convertible to gold directly by the central bank. It was backed by gold, but see. The expenditures were too much, and so the Nixon administration in '71 ended the backing of gold, and so they found a solution to it, which was to have it basically backed by oil. What happened was that in August of 1974, just as Richard Nixon was resigning, his then Secretary of Treasury, cut a deal with the Saudis that guaranteed that the United States would protect Saudi Arabia militarily and some other doodads here and there. But the Saudis promised that they would sell all of their oil in dollars, and they would take the exceedant from those sales and invest them in treasury bonds. This was the start of the petrodollar, because every country in the world needs oil for their industrial economy. And so if Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer, largest exporter, started selling its oil exclusively in dollars, then every other country in the world would need dollars to buy that oil, you see? And so the rest of the world started buying dollars in order to buy oil. If you produce something in Japan, say, and you get yen for it, well, you're going to need oil, and the oil is priced in dollars, so you're going to have to take your yen, sell them, and buy dollars with them. And so that's how the American economy has been propped up for the last, 50 odd years. It's coming up on 50 years, as a matter of fact, because this was in 74. And so this is the start of the petrodollar, okay? And this is how the American dollar has been propped up, because it's backed by oil. By way of Saudi Arabia, the other OPEC nations joined suit, and so here we are. Now, Saudi Arabia, its current leader, Mohammed bin Salman, who is the son of the king and is the de facto leader, and there's no doubt in anybody's mind that he's going to wind up being king at some point when his father dies. And he is a relatively young man. I believe he is 38, if memory serves. So he's going to be around for at least the next 20, 30 years. And so he is looking at Saudi Arabia's prospects with that kind of long-term vision. He sees the writing on the wall. Everybody realizes it, that the Americans are not a dependable partner. And so it's wise of him to start pivoting away from the United States. And so he has been doing this geopolitically and economically. Geopolitically, this big announcement where Iran and Saudi Arabia are going to reopen their embassies in each other's countries, this is a huge move. And the fact that the Chinese brokered this deal shows that the Chinese are the ones who can actually bring peace and order into international relations, because the American program over the last 20 odd years has been to sow chaos in the Middle East, with everybody fighting everybody else to the Americans' advantage. Whereas the Chinese are coming in with a much more conciliatory diplomacy to bring countries together. They succeeded in bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia together. And there's no doubt in anybody's mind that this partnership between Iran and Saudi Arabia is going to increase, which will be to the mutual benefit of Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it opens the door for both these countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, to pivot even more decisively towards their good buddy, China, which brokered this peace. And the Saudis are doing this. They are starting to sell oil in renminbi or yuan, or however you want to call it. And so they are pivoting towards China, selling more of their oil to the Chinese in yuan, not dollars. Now, other countries are going to start following suit, and people are going to realize, hey, we don't really need dollars. We might be able to get our oil in renminbi or rupees, because the Indians, of course, they are buying oil from the Russians. And they are marking it up and selling out this oil to foreign customers. Before the start of this war, the Russians were exporting to India something like 87,000 barrels a day, I believe. And now it's at 1.3, 1.4 million per day. And so the Indians are starting to sell this oil, and they're probably going to be demanding rupees pretty soon, if not already doing so. And so you see the oil as the backstop for the dollar is eroding. It's becoming a commodity that can be sold in multiple currencies that are not the dollar. And so that weakens dollar hegemony. Now, there will be a tipping point, a moment that there are so many people buying so much oil in other countries other than the dollar, that all of a sudden the dollar, everybody's going to ask themselves, well, why are we buying oil in dollars if the American economy is not involved? I'm, say, I don't know, Thailand buying oil from Saudi Arabia. Why do I have to get dollars? Why don't I just buy with, I actually don't know the currency of Thailand, but
Thai baht. Yeah.
Thai baht. Now, why don't they buy it just directly like that? And you see the situation. All of a sudden, there will be a tipping point where all the countries in the world say, we don't need the dollar. And this will be a disaster for the American economy, which is its prosperity and its military spending has depended so much on that foreign demand for dollars, you see? And so that's why the issue of Saudi Arabia pivoting away from the West, turning decisively towards China, towards Russia. Saudi and Russian relations are extremely good. Saudi and Chinese relations are extremely good. Just a few months ago, Saudi Arabia hosted Xi Jinping in his first trip in like quite a while. You know, he went to Saudi Arabia. That was a clear message. That was basically saying, the Chinese saying to the Saudis, we want to do business with you. We want to have you as one of our most important strategic partners, the way we have Russia as our, you know, our most important strategic partner. And so you see the rest of the world is pivoting away from the West. And the United States, because of all its various escapades, if you will, it can't really do much about what Saudi Arabia is doing, especially because Mohammed bin Salman has the country so firmly in hand, and the possibility of like a color revolution or some effort at destabilization of the Saudi regime is just not really possible. And so, you know, all of a sudden the United States is finding itself friendless, and with other people using other currencies to buy oil, hurting the American economy. Does this answer your question?
Yes, it does. And when you really think about it, what was the U.S. doing in the Middle East all of this time? They were destabilizing it, and they surrounded Saudi Arabia with, you know, they created hostility between these nations, essentially surrounding Saudi Arabia with hostile nations. And even though those nations were justified in their hostility, this was almost a way the U.S. was holding Saudi Arabia hostage. You know, keep the petrodollar going, or else we'll just, you know, we won't shield you from these nations. And then what happened is China's going in there and they're stabilizing the region. They're giving Saudi Arabia and everyone else the ability to move out from under this specter of constant war, and allowing them to do that pivot. Now, because we're getting close to an hour, I guess I want to go to this question, and we'll start with Alex. If that is happening, if the petrodollar is disintegrating, and they have all of these problems, nobody trusts the West and their financial system and their leadership role globally, what does the United States do next? What do you think they're going to do next?
Well, they're going to panic, and they are panicking. They continue to panic. When you see everybody do a bank run and down it within 48 hours, like I said at the start of the program, there's one door to get out, and they're all trying to get out of the same door. The problem here is there's been failed policies that have been continually happening with the government. You know, their build back, I called it the build back bankrupt, because it never really happened. That's the build back, I think it was build back better plan that the administration tried to bring forward for infrastructure. But here's what China does. China goes into these countries. All right, you need a loan. Now, of course, the Western smear campaign says, you know, they're just going to throw a bunch of money in this country and make it broke. They're not going to be able to pay it back. The French, the British, they've had Africa for years to do something down there, and they never did it. Okay, it fit to their narrative that, hey, they were happy with the status quo. China rolls into town, diplomacy rolls into town, infrastructure rolls into town. Hey, you need a bridge, you need a hospital, you need schools. Yeah, but we can't really afford it. We got you, but we can't really we'll finance it. Okay, and while you're at it, you need a railway, you need some infrastructure, and let's connect it to this country that we already built for. Oh, and we got buddies over in this country that's connected it. And don't worry, your port of goods, we got that covered too, and we'll make things easier for you to ship goods. In America, we have an economy, I call it the Lego economy. That's right, you didn't hear that wrong, the Lego economy. Now, what I mean by that is, look closely the next time you hear somebody in the United States or some of the unions talk about these car plants. Okay, these big, you know, General Motors and Ford, and you know, these are big companies that the politicians want to show that they get behind. These are really not manufacturing plants. These are assembly plants. So imagine somebody in China sends you a bag of Legos whatever you want. Let's call it tires and a couple of doors and bumpers and whatever. And they ship it over to you in America. Well, the America, they make maybe the frames. Maybe they still do. And then you start assembling everything just like it's Lego. Now, the Americans complain about this trade surplus, but they are ordering in, follow me on this, guys, ordering in all this product, Lego, assembling it, and then shipping off to other countries. Now, that doesn't get counted as an export. So we have a lot of countries that are dependent. It could be anything from cars to bicycles to, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I haven't seen too many TV or mobile manufacturing plants in North America the last time I was down there, or refrigerators. And if they are, most of them are being pretty much shipped from here, assembled in the United States, and then to the, the commercial market. The problem with this is, when you start screwing around your supply chain and you start being mean and you start throwing tariffs in there and you start screwing around with the global economy, the lights can quickly go out on you, because what used to be one of the only markets for China has moved over. We have the International Land Sea Trade Corridor, which is connecting all of Southeast Asia, which used to take 45 days to get cargo into countries like Thailand. Takes 20 days, no custom clearance. It can be done in 4 hours. Now, are you going to export something on a tanker ship from halfway across the United States and it's going to land in your port 45 days? That used to be the game in town. But now we're seeing the Belt and Road Initiative, the important markets that are really, the Chinese are really branching into these markets now. When you lay 60,000 domestic tracks of high-speed rail through your country, and then you start connecting it to the Laos, to the Myanmar. These are countries, and you know this, Brian, these are countries that the Americans are just dying to destabilize with NGO organizations. That's where I'm going to hand it back to you, because you know exactly where I'm going with it.
But yeah, that is a great explanation, Alex, and I'm glad you talked about that, because that was basically going to be what I said. They're desperate, and they're going to start destabilize. Whatever they have left that they're good at, which is destabilizing and destroying. Angelo, what does the U.S. do now? Where do they go?
Well, I think they're desperate. I think what the downfall could be really, really bad for the U.S. I just hope that there's a bailing out at some point, that they sit down. We need adults in the room. I think also there's something very interesting what happened since there's this confrontation of NATO against Russia. What we found out is that those concepts of GDP are completely false. I think we need to review what is a real GDP. There's I would call it two adjustments. One adjustment is a purchasing power parity. So when you do that calculation, you find out that actually Chinese economy is bigger than the US. Now, if you talk about the real economy, because I think that Western economies, because they're service-oriented and because of they are very inflated. You have lawyers that they makes too much money. You have healthcare, which is completely inflated. The real economy is smaller than what they say. I'll give you an example. Healthcare in the GDP of the US, it accounts for 18%. In China, it's 6%. What the difference is inflated. It's completely inflated GDP. So if you look at manufacturing, you have in China 3 times the manufacturing that you have in the US. So we need to be extremely careful. So now the collective West is in reality much smaller and not as powerful than what we might think. I just want to add one more thing. Just when we talk about the allies of the US, it's interesting. These days we found out that you have countries that were allies for a long time. They shifted completely overnight. But think about Saudi Arabia. So 50 years of protection and so on from the US in exchange of the petrodollar. When in 2021, Russia signed an agreement between Russia and Saudi Arabia for protection. So so we talk about a possible color revolution. I don't think it would happen, because we might see actually the same as we saw in Kazakhstan, having Russians going into Saudi Arabia and calming, just protecting Mohammed bin Salman. So Saudi Arabia, for example, they shifted. Iran, they used to be an ally of the US. Under the Shah of Iran, they were allies. Turkey, the US did a coup in Turkey in 2016. You had Iraq, not so long ago. Iraq fought for the collective West against Iran. So you see, there are many countries that see that the US, you don't have a long-term friend, but it's just a tool. While when you see China, the relationship that China has, the relationship that Russia has, just think about it. Russia has been a longtime friend of India. Why India is not turning its back on Russia now? Well, they've been friends for 40 years. They're not going to change that. Syria, they were friends when there was a Soviet Union. You know what? Syria got into trouble. Russia was there. Would you trust the same when it comes to the US? You got to be careful. You know what? It's not a trustable partner, and the global South knows that. So they'd rather in Africa, they'd rather have Wagner, there than having the French or any countries from the collective West.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up about GDP, and I think we're seeing that right now. The U.S. proxy war against Russia, their industrial base, the West's collective industrial base, is unable to supply weapons to Ukraine on the scale necessary to match or exceed Russian firepower. I think that's very interesting, and that's when all of this, this is it. When you have this puffed up economy, and you're pretending that it's much bigger than it really is. But when it comes down to industry, that's when everyone can see through it. That's when the illusion starts to fade. Gonzalo.
Yeah, Warren Buffett has a saying that you can only tell who's swimming naked when the tide pulls out. It's a very wise saying. And the American economy has been swimming naked for 40 years, I would argue. Because it's completely deindustrialized. And like to Alex's point, yeah, it created this Lego economy where you have parts manufactured overseas, brought to the United States, just put together, and ta-da, we have an addition to the GDP, when that's not really the case. Well, to Angelo's point, he thinks that, at some point there's going to be a change in American leadership where the adults will enter the room and take over. I, unfortunately, am not so conclusion.
No, I don't believe it. I don't believe it would happen. It's just impossible.
Yeah. That's what needs to happen, but it's not going to happen.
But it won't happen because
democracy has been hijacked. It's not democracy. I think it's a joke. I think we need to.
Yeah, we have basically an incompetent leadership class. And look, I went to university in the early 90s, and I went to a university that produced a lot of people who wound up in positions of leadership in the various sectors. Law, medicine. I mean, I was recruited by Goldman Sachs when I was a senior there, and because they recruited there because Hank Paulson was from Dartmouth. But the point is that that leadership class has been incompetent for several decades now, and what has happened is that the truly capable people have essentially died out, and so you have a bunch of people who are running things who are very adept at swimming through this social sea and climbing to very powerful leadership positions, but they don't actually know what the hell they're doing. And for people who are outside this particular ziggurat, this particular structure, they don't believe it. They don't think that people are this stupid. Oh, they are. They're incredibly stupid, surprisingly uneducated and parochial in their outlook, and almost having an impossibility of putting themselves into the shoes of the other and seeing a particular deal, how the other would be affected by it. It's rather shocking when you start actually interacting with these people who are in positions of leadership. And so I personally don't think that the Americans are going to do anything other than panic, and they're going to throw everything at the wall to see what sticks. And it's going to be very, very ugly. Okay. And now clearly the Ukraine situation the Americans at some point are going to realize that they cannot go in with boots on the ground. I mean, like, the famous line from The Princess Bride, rule number one, you do not get into a land war with Russia. Yeah, I mean, that's just crazy. So they're going to eventually pull out and realize that this is just not worth it, especially as the military catastrophe that we are seeing unfolding, blossoms fully, and we see the scope of the losses and destruction, and that there's no way for the West to prop up the Zelensky regime, which is going to end, And so what I believe will happen is that they're going to turn their full attention to China. Brian, you yourself told me in a private conversation, the amount of anti-China rhetoric that is coming out of the West is off the charts. It's bordering on open racism towards the Chinese. They are gearing up for a war with China. And this is my macro prediction that I've said before, and I'm happy to repeat. In 2023, at some point mid-year towards the fall, the West is going to realize that Ukraine is a lost cause. Let's pivot definitively towards China. And they're going to announce this with some sort of initial round of sanctions against China. And it's going to be a big brouhaha. And they're going to start on the famous sanctions escalator metaphor that Alexander Mercouris came up with, which is very appropriate, because once you're on that escalator, you can't get off. And they're going to have more and more sanctions against China. But it's going to be a replay of the sanctions against Russia that hurt the Europeans. The sanctions against China are going to hurt the Americans. And as the economic situation deteriorates further into 2023, and especially 2024, because of the sanctions against China, which are completely predictable, that number one, that's what they're going to do. Number two, the damage to the American economy that these sanctions against China would inflict. Well, they're going to panic even more, and they're eventually going to go for all-out war with China with no clear military objective or way to use the military to fix the economic catastrophe that will be unfolding in the United States. And so what will happen is that there will be a war between the United States and China, I believe, in 2025. I think that a lot of people in positions of leadership are already gearing up for it, already looking forward to it. And I do not see a way out of this catastrophic destiny that the United States is leading the West into. I mean, this is my sincere belief, and I'm willing to, argue it and defend this position, because it's really, at the end of the day, it's always about people, the people in positions of leadership. Who are they? Are they capable people? Are they flexible people? Are they people who have a measure of humility, enough humility to understand the point of view of their opposing member, of their counterpart? If they don't have that humility, that level of empathy, that ability and basic competence, then you're going to see, a car crash. And so that's what I think that we're going to see. We're going to see a car crash. It's very predictable how it's going to happen.
Yes, Alex, I just want to throw in there, because I think I agree. I think that's what they're going to do. They know this financial and economic situation cannot be fixed, and they see China surpassing the collective West, not just the US, the whole West. And what they're going to do is they're going to figure, well, we're already done. We're going to wage this war against China, try to level the playing field, knock everyone down back to zero, and then we'll have a chance to reassert ourselves then, because it's definitely not going to happen now. And they're going to start a war. They're going to try to use their navy globally to seize and block Chinese shipping. And I think China is aware of that. They're getting ready for it. Alex.
I just wanted to say, before I came on this program, Brian spoke to me about the finance part of this conversation tonight. And I think a lot of people from my channel that are watching tonight are a little bit confused, because I've never actually really spoken about this part of my life, being a derivative trader on my channel. Most people just know me as a guy in media here in China. But I wanted to kind of just let your audience know that there's some pretty dark things going on in these financial markets. And spending 20 years in Monaco, I was taught by a very, very intelligent trader from Switzerland. And he described to me in detail over a 4-week period he was teaching me. And I thought I knew everything about the financial markets. Really, I did. And as the explanation and the dinner got heavily into what he was doing, I said, there's no possible way how can this guy know more about these financial markets than me? I've been trading stocks, prior to moving to Monaco for a good 6-7 years. And he showed me a side of the market that I would put money on it, that almost 99.9% of the common people that are in the stock market today have absolutely no idea about. Okay? That's the derivatives market. The derivatives market make the actual stock market look like a kindergarten class. These are the people that are making the shifts in these financial markets. I've been in it for now, I think, I'm going to say maybe close to 20 years trading these derivatives. Don't own a share. And I will explain that in another completely different video. Maybe I'll make one on my channel. I don't know. If people are interested, you can find me on my channel. Just send me a comment. I'll email you. What's happened here is, listen to how crazy this is, but it's true. The derivatives market, and I'm going to give it to you in layman's terms for the viewers. It's basically like me or you or the average person will go and say, I don't think the Dow Jones or the S&P will drop 20% this month. Now, right now, for that contract, or we'll call it insurance, right now, somebody's willing to pay you almost 20% for that. Okay, and that shows you the volatility in the market. Now, if it doesn't fall that much, you keep your, we'll call it premiums, okay? I'm not going to get too heavily into this, but here's what's happened in the United States of America. Guess who can't trade these derivatives? You, the Americans, can't trade them. I can trade them because I'm outside of the United States of America. You cannot. Now, why is that possible? Why don't they want the average person? Well, they'll hide behind it and say, it's very risky. No, sure, everything's risky. Hell, just investing in Credit Suisse is risky over the last couple of days. They won't let you in that market. Now, there's ways around that, of course. You used to be able to go to Switzerland and open up a margin account that you could trade derivatives on these markets. But what did they do to the Swiss banking industry? They shut that down too, so that you can't, or the Swiss simply don't want you as a client. Okay, now as you see, you're being kept out of a game. There are other openings around the world, other countries that are willing to facilitate you in their banking industry that will allow you to trade these types of products. But can you imagine this? 300 and some million Americans cannot write what I'll call insurance or derivatives even to protect their portfolio on their own market, yet everybody outside of the United States can. That right there shows you the house is rigged like it's never been rigged before. And trust me, the day will come, and I'm not throwing out conspiracy theories here, guys. 2008, February 5th, I nailed it within 3 days, okay? The March 20 sell-off, Brian, I don't know if you were there. I nailed that within about 4 days, okay? We are about to enter into very, 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 I'm going to call them dark times for the next 18 months here. You're going to see some pops in the markets and some sell-offs in the markets, but you got to ask yourself, even today, what on earth is the S&P, the 500 highest companies by market cap? What on earth is it doing at 3,900 when you have so many trillions of dollars in debt and bank failures? My prediction, this is not a recommendation to buyers to sell any securities. I'm going to put that out there again. But I would say realistically, if it was me, or what do I analyze, the S&P should be trading at about 1,800 to 2,000. That's where I think we will get more of a reality of where this market is. And as all three of these gentlemen displayed to you today, there's inflation in homes, there's inflation in electricity prices, and for sure, there's inflation in your stock markets in the United States of America. Over to you guys.
Angelo, you have anything to add or any last closing thoughts?
Last thought, well, it's about leadership. Gonzalo mentioned about the leadership in the US, which is completely helpless. I like to compare the leadership you have in the US and in China. I mean, the gap is so big. so big. In China, you have people that are STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering. So you have those guys are very scientific, and they've been working through the system. The thing is that if you from a Westerner's perspective, you look at them, you like, that's boring. I mean, scientific people, they're boring. They're not sexy. They're not going to tell you what you want to hear. In the West, look at their profile. Macron, Sunak, Trudeau. I mean, they are like what we call in France, garçon café. Like long, like slim fit. You know what I mean? You just, they look good. They're young. They look dynamic, and they are going to tell you what you want to hear. And it's very emotional. See, two different cultures. The West is perception, emotion. The East is rational. It might be boring for foreigners, but like you talk to a Chinese and you say, I'm going to give you freedom, democracy, and so on. You talk about sexuality and so on. The Chinese is like, no, man, I want longevity. I want access to, healthcare. I want to send my kids to school. I want food on the table. You're talking, it's so abstract. Just get real. And this is what the collective West needs to do. It's get real. What are you offering to your people? Macron, he wakes up in the morning. He's not thinking about what can I bring to France. He's not working for French people. You see, tomorrow, the next few days in France, we have potentially a color revolution. A revolution, not a color revolution, a revolution. People are tired. We've been lied to, and there's one thing which is really interesting to compare. It's levels of satisfactions. Putin gets 80%. The CPC in China, 90 to 95%. I'm talking about the Harvard University, MIT studies, and so on. Westerners might not like it. It's boring, of course. It's boring, but they deliver, and people there, they love it. So now we need adults. We need the adults. The system is completely rigged. It gives an illusion of free choice. It's not. It's just more subtle. You get to vote, but you know what? You get to vote between two candidates that were pre-selected. You had no free will. In China, if you study the system, and that would be, that would be for a separate episode, but it's far more democratic. But the thing is that we have 30, 40 years of brainwashing that we are the best, and we are going to teach the world how to deal better. Well, you know what? What is the result? Did it deliver? I mean, the tangible things? No, it's crashing. The wealth of the West has been built at the expense of the rest of the world. And those guys are waking up. And I just hope that when they wake up, that they are going to be not as bad as we were to them.
I like just get real. I mean, this is
strong, guys. For the end, it's strong.
No, it's
really
it's
feel that. It's. I've been here. I saw China 30 years ago, 3 decades ago, and you know what? There's lots of things I don't like about China, but you know what? I talk to people. Everybody's like, you know what? We love it. We know we get to travel abroad. Our life is better. And I've seen, I've been to villages in China. They had no shoes. There was no electricity, no shoes. I'm talking about very small villages. No electricity, no shoes. I was there. I saw it. Now I see it. I cannot recognize. It's going too fast for me.
Angelo, you make a very, very good point there about, how the governments are set up here with the CPP, CC, and the NPC, similar to the Senate and the House in the United States. But also there's unelected people that are brought on to influence that have, very, very smart minds with no political ambitions here in China, but are brought in to help the government understand. You can't expect, let's look at the Canadian politics, not the greatest example, but let's use it anyway. You can't tell me that people that are running for Canadian politics are there sitting there with, master's degrees. You don't get paid that much to be a politician in Canada. So people that have those types of influences are not either involved in the government, but they are smart people that are needed to help the government understand what the decisions they are making for 1.5 billion people. And having that part of the NPC, or we'll call it the you have the Senate part and the House part. We'll call it the Senate part or the House part, whatever you want, just to try to give you an understanding about it. That influence that comes into China is huge, because this country is a massive, massive country, and it needs these types of brains to help the government. You can't just say, okay, we'll elect these people and they go make the decisions. True, they make the decisions, but they're making it based on even suggestions from intelligent people. The more I study, and Angelo, the more I understand the way that this country here of China is moving forward, I have to tell you, I am glad I'm here. You hear people say, well, if it's so great, China, move there. Well, I did, and that's where I am.
Well, if Peter Zion were hearing this, he'd have a stroke, because he's saying that China is going to collapse any day now. So
who's that? Chang? Is that Gordon Chang? Who's that?
Peter Zion. He's a geopolitical commentator who's an idiot. He's a complete.
He's the bottom feeder of all the other idiots. He's eating the leftovers at the very bottom.
No, and I'm bringing up Peter Zion to give a very important point. I think the culture in the West is that nobody wants to face reality. People are happy to be fed lies and pretend that they live in a world that is much better than it actually is. And when you have a culture that is based on accepting lies about reality, then very soon you see the populace as a whole start to detach itself from reality altogether. I mean, look at various social phenomena that have happened, like trans, for instance, that whole nonsense, or this notion of like, oh yeah, I want to choose my gender, or stuff like that, or choose my pronouns, or whatever the hell. All of this is detachment from reality, okay? Whereas in the East, I'm talking about the Eurasian continent, I'm including Russia and China. Sorry about that, I can't help it. Well, in those continents, in that continent, those countries, they look at things as they actually are. They don't fool themselves by pretending that the problem doesn't exist, or that the problem is not a problem and it's just, something magical, and come up with magical thinking. No, in Eurasia, they look at the facts as they are and try to deal with them as best they can. In the West, they make up shit and they buy their own lies. And that's why you're having the problem, basically, that the West is finally crashing into reality. It's financial reality, it's industrial reality, it's a military reality, it's political reality. And that crash is very, very ugly, because they are finally getting to a point where their lies are no longer viable. I mean, when they started floating the idea that on some pleasure yacht they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, that was a clue. That was the most ridiculous lie, and everybody just laughed at their face. But it proves my point, that they think that if they can lie their way through reality and nobody will notice. But that's over. People now see reality, and the whole thing is collapsing.
I think that's really
mute myself. I'm sorry about this.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. What you mentioned just before, Gonzalo, this thing about, why do you have those issues? And those issues, let's say LGTB and so on, just why it was not organic, those are ways to divide people. They are distraction. They're distraction. You don't wake up in the morning. Your main thinking is about that issue or your sexuality. I mean, that's a private issue. Who cares? Who cares? Don't touch kids and animals. That's all, So you see, those things are a way to distract people and divide them, and then people put themselves into boxes. This is why, and we had this discussion with Brian before. I don't like people putting ourselves, when you put yourself into a box. Oh, I'm a MAGA. Oh, I'm a pro-Trump. Oh, I'm a communist. You know what? We all have a common enemy. They are the elites, the big corporation. They want us to be put in two boxes so we fight each other. Why do you think in France they've been fighting those politicians? They've been fighting each other. you know. And while who's the enemies is those globalists that are running the country. They don't care about France at all, at all. So again, we need to be very careful. We have our opinions when it comes to society, of course. Lots of things I don't agree with those nuts, you know, because they're nuts. But we need to ask the question why, and that's a way to divide people. So we need to be you know, Chinese, they you know, some wisdom, Chinese wisdom. You know, I mentioned before, 九洞顺义. Look for what unites us and put aside the differences. If people had that wisdom, you'd realize that 95% of Americans, they join forces together and topple those elites that are selfish and greedy.
Yeah, exactly. Imperialism works by dividing and conquering, and people think that, well, that's just something that happens over there in Asia or Africa. It can't happen here, but actually in the United States, it most certainly is happening. The people running the U.S., the interests controlling U.S. domestic and foreign policy, they don't see themselves as Americans. Americans are just another people to conquer. And so they're just dividing these people against each other. I like this conversation about being practical versus the fantasy world that even the top leadership class in the U.S. Lives in. They live in a fantasy world. When you read their policy papers and the premise that the United States should hold primacy over the globe when it represents a fraction of the global population, industrial output, and everything else. That is a fantasy, and then everything is built on top of that, which means that the foundation is soft, and everything built on top of it is going to make it sink. And that's what we're watching. But unfortunately, the United States comes from a time where people were practical. They did build an immense, powerful nation, and that momentum is going to be used as their last card. Maybe we'll just go around one more time and see if we've got final thoughts. Alex, you got any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
Well, I just want to thank everyone once again for inviting me onto the show. What a treat it was when I told my wife I was coming on here on Friday night. She said, "Yeah, that's the show that you need to go on." And I'm so blessed to come on here, and thank you for that. I just want to tell the viewers that, you know, living here in China, what I've seen here in the last few years, I've been coming to China for about 20 years, off and on, a little bit of business here and there, but living here has been a real eye opener. And it's some things that I see that I used to enjoy in life, maybe in my younger years in Canada, but where I saw a drastic change as society kind of, we'll call it, went down the tubes. I see cars here on a daily basis with no key marks, no broken windows. I see people walking the streets, being able to wear watches. I see people enjoying themselves in the parks without any crazy stuff going on. I see people enjoying sitting down in city centers, living their life in comfort and safety. I see people enjoying, going to the shopping mall or walking along the riverbanks where there's a clean environment, looking up at a blue sky. And I have to tell you, being here in China really brought memories of my youth back, of what Canada once was. And here, it's a country that is civil. People care about each other. If something happens to that person, they're the first to be there. I have colleagues that I'm around on a daily basis that say, "Hey, good morning. How was your night the night before?" This is a country that maybe in some way where we'll see a lot of people make comments saying, "Well, they're cut off from the world," or "they're censored from this and that." I have to tell you, when my mom calls me from Canada and says, "Did you see this on the news?" I have to tell you, you know what? Most of the time I don't. And maybe it's for a good reason, because a lot of the stuff that goes on in the Western media, we can do without. And here's the beautiful thing. You have 4 people on this panel tonight with over 5,000 people watching internationally, being able to share you a vision of what our life is like all around the world. Where else do you get that anywhere in the world? And once again, Brian and Gonzalo and Angelo, I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to join this panel tonight. Thank you, guys.
Sure. Thank you. Angelo.
I just want to add one thing. It's very counterintuitive for people. When we talk about China like this, to be honest, I love my country more than ever, more than anything, really. I love my country. This is probably why I do this. We need to educate. Somehow we need to bridge this gap of knowledge. China is a good place. If you knew, right now, Friday, all around China, nighttime, you know what they do? It's a common practice. It's something that people love it. We might not love it back in the West, but they go in big square and they dance, and you should look at their face. They're happy people. They're happy. So there's so much to say about China. So it's more, I love as much China as my country, but I just wish my country and people in my country, they would just learn more. Because at least Chinese, there's one thing that they do. They know so much about us, our culture, and our political system, our president, and so on. In the West, what do we know about China? The maximum that average Joe in the West knows about China politics is Xi Jinping. That's all. That's all. When you talk to Chinese, I tell you, the average cab man, taxi driver, he'll tell you everything about French politics and so on. And this is what we say, like Sun Tzu, know yourself and know your enemy. Well, we don't even know ourselves, our own system. We don't, and we want to criticize China. Well, wake up. That's what I want to say. Wake up. Additional to that, I want to say, well, it's a pleasure, just to be in this panel with you guys. I enjoy it, and that's why, it's I wouldn't exchange this against, Friday night. It's my best Friday night.
Thank you, Gonzalo.
Yeah, my final thoughts. They're a little bit all over the place, but I'll just say the following. Short term, the U.S. economy is in serious trouble, the financial sector, but it's going to spread to the whole economy. And so short term, that's the thing to pay attention to. Medium term, the pivot of the Americans towards China to battle the Chinese, because they're going to give up the ghost here in Ukraine, realizing that it's a lost cause, and there isn't anything practical that they can do to change the outcome, which I believe, and I have thought since pretty much the beginning of this conflict, would eventually end in the military occupation of the entirety of what was formerly Ukraine by the Russian army. And they're going to split up the country. They're going to take some pieces that they want, and they'll leave a rump Ukraine state. And there is nothing the West can do about it, short of going into some sort of suicidal and pyrrhic battle against the Russians, because for the Russians, they're in it to win it, because this is existential for them. And long term, I think that the West is going to go through a catastrophic decade, and there isn't going to be a leadership class that will be able to bring things back for many years. I would argue at least a couple of generations. I'm talking 50 years. Because the prosperity that exists in the West in the post-war period, that model is simply unsustainable, and it has been almost deliberately sabotaged by the people in charge who are so incompetent. And because of how they have so corrupted the educational system and the means by which they select the leadership class, we will not see capable people rise up in the West and take the helm, adults, people who are competent. We are not going to see that class for at least a couple of decades, until all the garbage is flushed through the system of the educational system and the system by which the leadership class and the leadership cadres are selected in every area, in every sector of American or Western society. We're going to have to go through a horrible period in the West. And it's remarkable that I'm going to see a big chunk of this in my lifetime. I thought that this would happen probably after I'm dead. Just because, 10 years ago, if you told me that we were in this position, I wouldn't have believed you. But here we are. We're staring at a conflagration with the United States and China, and a complete collapse of the Western economic industrial society. It is remarkable. This is end of the Roman Empire kind of thing. And I feel happy to be watching it from almost the epicenter at this time of the conflict. So yeah, and Brian, of course, Angelo, it's a pleasure to see you as always. Alex, it was a pleasure to meet you. And Brian, as always, it's a pleasure talking to you. You know, people don't know it, but Brian and I, once in a while, we'll just shoot each other a quick Skype message. Hey, let's talk for 5 minutes, you know, just to say hi, just to catch up. And it's like 3 hours later, we're still talking like a couple of old maids. You know, it's really a lot of fun. So anyway, Brian,
we are big fans. You know, I was thinking, Brian. You know, there are two people. I would just drop anything for if I'm doing something to go on your show is you and Galloway, and that's yeah. And you know how much I respect Galloway. So big respect for your work. And again, you know, I don't know if people know, but Brian has been working on this for the last decade. So you know, and he was on the ground when. Writing article under pen name. So big respect, Brian, for what you do.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I haven't done a panel like this before, but this was great. So I'm definitely going to want to do this again. I want to thank everyone for coming on and sharing your expertise, because this is a topic that this is not really my area of expertise, but I know the three of you have backgrounds in this, and that's why I brought you on, and you didn't disappoint at all. And I hope the audience learned a lot. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. Check the video description below. I've got Gonzalo and Alex's links there. And then if you scroll down, you will find Angelo and other places you can find my work as well. Again, thank you. It's Friday night. Thank you so much for joining me. And until next time, bye for now.